In this video, we'll take a look at giving users control, the use of the interactive dialog statements. Interactive dialog statements are high-level BDL statements that substitute for many lines of code needed to perform some basic tasks. Each statement turns control over to the user to perform the task. For example, on the right on this table, you see the statement used, for example, menu, and the task that it does, that statement, allows the user to select from a list of actions. Using the construct statement, you'll be able to let the user enter database search criteria directly on the form. If the user is going to select information displayed from database tables that you've displayed to a form, you'll be using the display and or the display array statements in your code. And if the user needs to modify the data, for example, adding, updating, and deleting data through the form, you'll be using the input and input array statements in your code. Let's first look at the menu statement. On the left, you see a code example of a menu block, and you can see that it's simply listing out a set of actions. And on the right, you'll see a picture there showing a screenshot of a program that has that menu represented. Now, menus can be represented in a variety of ways because they're really just a set of actions available to the user. So in your programs, you might choose to have those actions appear at the top as a toolbar, for example. But the code for the menu, the set of actions available during this part of the program, would be available there in a menu block. The construct statement is used to allow the user to enter search criteria in the form. So a simple construct statement is shown here, showing that we're going to construct by name a variable called where clause. We're going to pull together a new variable that is going to get passed to our select statement given what the user has entered into the fields available. Now here we've only allowed them to enter search criteria on the store num and the phone fields or columns. And you can see that there in the picture. So the construct by name says, let's build a where clause based on what the user has provided. And we'll build that and we'll pass that in the rest of the code. You would see it passed to the select statement to then go and retrieve the data based on what the user had requested. The display statement allows you to take a record of data, some data that you have returned from the database, and display it to the form. When we use display by name, we typically see display by name and then the name of the record that's storing the data, and we're going to make a one-to-one match between what's in that record, those values in the record, and the fields on the form. So it will populate the form fields with the values in that customer record. So the display statement is valuable in that you're going to allow the user to view the data that has been retrieved. The bottom example here, display custrec.storenum to cust field, is showing that you can also take a specific piece of data and you could display it to a particular object on the form. Display array is like display in that you're letting the user view some data. Display array, though, allows you to display the data that is stored in the array to an object on the form that can manage that data. So here we see a table on the form, and we are going to display the store R array to the screen array cust.star. So we're going to display all the values from store R to the screen array as defined in the form, and here it's a table type structure. So now the user has viewed data, we also need to provide them the ability to modify data, and we use the input statement, an input block, to give the user access to modify data or to add new data to a form. Here we can see that we've opened up an entire form for them to type in the data, and you can see on the right there those OK and cancel buttons. given that we are in an input statement with an end input keyword, we need to turn control over to the user and then allow them to either accept or cancel that action that we've given them control of. So when we're in an input statement, we also have blocks of code before input, before field, things like that to help manage the user through the task of inputting data. Now, if we're doing an update, we would be preserving the data that they're looking at and then allowing them to update those fields directly on the form. And the same is true with input array. So here we're looking at an array of data displayed in a table. And again, just like our input statement, input array instead allows us to map our array that has the data within it to the form object, which is here is a table that we're populating. So as the user clicks around in this table, they'd be able to directly modify the data. And you can see the actions there on the right-hand side. We might be giving them some actions that allow them to insert, append, delete different rows of data there. Now, multiple dialogues mean that we are using the various dialogue statements or interactive dialogue blocks in parallel. So in this particular form, what we see is an input, a construct, and a display all available to the user at one time. They don't have to first accept one interactive dialogue first before moving on to the next one. That's what we call multiple dialogues. By default, when you use the interactive dialogue statements, those are simply single dialogue, what we call single dialogue, because they work independently of each other. But with the more recent versions of Genero, you can use what we call a dialogue statement to create a multiple dialogue style form. So again, any area on the form here can be accessed by the user, but each is controlled by a different interactive dialogue statement. Here's what some example code might look like for a multiple dialogue, working in a multiple dialogue with a multiple dialogue form. We have two different display array statements. So this would be a list type form, maybe two lists, one on the left, one on the right. Both display data. As the user selects data, they can choose from one or both of those display arrays at the same time. They don't have to if they've selected one on the left, they don't have to deselect that before selecting one on the right. So just an example of how that code looks. And you'll see that it begins with a dialogue statement and ends with the end dialogue. And then within there, you would see any of those interactive dialogue statements that we have looked at. And again, that's called the multiple dialogue feature. Something else to keep in mind with interactive dialogue statements is we have a class in the UI package called UIDialog, and it's a class that has methods that can be used with the dialogue statements. And methods are like global functions, as they have sort of pre-packaged a lot of functionality into using a method, which prevents you from having to write a lot of code to do the same thing. So looking at this little example here, the interactive dialogue that we're in is an input. And within this input, if this action disable is triggered, we're going to call dialog.setFieldActive. So the method is setFieldActive. We're providing what field we're referencing and then what we want to do with it. We want to turn it to false. So here, in essence, what we're providing is when the user's in an input, this input block, they have an action available called disable. If that's triggered, the cust ID field is going to be unavailable. It's not going to be active any longer. So the dialog reference here is referencing the current dialog. So it's this within an input. So it's referencing this input dialog statement. And this set field active is just one of many methods available to help you easily work within those interactive dialogue statements. Okay, so in sum, we've looked at the interactive dialogue statements, which are menu, display, display array, construct, input, and input array. These statements pack a lot of functionality into a minimal amount of code. They allow you to turn control over to the user to perform a task. And when that user has performed the task in an example such as input and construct and input array, the user would have to accept or cancel their work before continuing. Now, that would be in a single dialog example. In multiple dialog, the interactive dialog statements can work in parallel, where they are all available and do not have to first be accepted or canceled prior to the user jumping into another part of the form to work with it, which might be managed by a completely other interactive dialog statement.